Good evening, everybody. Hey, it's air conditioned. Thanks for coming and missing part two of the Night Begins to Shine special Teen Titans Fortnite event. Anybody else? No, my kids watch. It's hilarious. Anyway, uh, I'm sure you can all TiVo it or whatever the kids do these days. Yeah, it's hot. I'm tired. I'll probably be a little more loopy than usual, as might you. So here's what I thought I'd do tonight. So Project 4, supposed to be due tonight. It was clear from all the conversations that we had on the community, the emails that you guys were sending me, we need some more time. There were some confusions about sort of what the assignment should do and stuff about how it should work and how it should do it. So let's say a couple more days, make sure that everybody learns what they need to learn and gets their programs to do what they need to do. So I want to reserve some time to talk about Project 4 if there's more to talk about tonight. I also want to dig into Project 5, which I realize people that are still focusing on Project 4 might be kind of hard to concentrate on. That's why we record this, so that you can go back in a few more days once Project 4 is all squared away and watch what we did here with Project 5 to get your feet wet with Google Web Toolkit. And then if there's more time left and if we don't feel like braving the heat, then we can do some more pair programming. So a fun night ahead for us all. So Project 4. Last night I banged out some code that I hope will help demonstrate how to use some of the functionality, some of the helper classes that I put together for you guys. I think I've come to realize that like the simple key value pair example was only helpful to a point. And then afterwards, it was like more confusing. So for next time, for next term, next time I offer this, I'll do better. I'll come up with a different example that maybe isn't so confusing, so we don't have questions like, wait a second, we're supposed to store the airlines in a hash map. Well, no, darn, that wasn't the right thing. It was like, you're supposed to replace the hash map with an airline, and like, why didn't I just say that? That might have been helpful. So I'll try better on that. Okay, so but what questions do you have about Project 4? Either the functionality or how to implement it. Yes.
This is kind of like more on testing, but would
Yep.
you go into like more in depth on how to use like Mockito to like
Yeah.
make mocks and do like the unit test for the server?
Sure. I can. I can show some of that. It's pretty wacky, huh? And Mockito is covered in the dependency injection lecture, I think.
Okay.
But it's this magic. And like once you figure out how to use it, you're like, great, the magic works for me. But until then, it's kind of a wacky. Yeah, we can certainly look at that because actually they'll play nicely. So so Mockito. Any other sort of general questions? Yeah.
Can you just demonstrate how the project's supposed to be? Do you have an example other than
Yeah, I can like show you my command line that I wrote last night, which the command line syntax isn't correct, but I assume that you guys can figure it out. You guys know how to do that. There's no question, right? You've demonstrated it for like 3 projects now. So I can do that. Does chair go any higher? Yes. Okay. I sit down and it goes down. Okay, so command line, Mockito. Someone else had a question?
Mine is kind of about debugging things.
Uh-huh.
So like, I'm having an issue right now where sometimes things work and sometimes they don't. So
Oh,
and
yeah.
I kind of narrowed it down to where like the first time I start Jetty,
Uh-huh.
I can add a flight.
Yep.
No problems.
Mhm.
All my tests pass. And then when I go back, well, except for the second test, which is this one, if I try to add a flight again after the first flight, I get a server error.
Oh,
I'm trying
interesting.
to figure out how to trace that. Like,
Yeah.
Are there any good ways to trace those kinds of problems? Where
Well, there's like debugging, and so let's take a look at debugging and maybe the kind of logging that you should do. Good.
all right.
Any other things? Specific questions that this is the time, right? It's like don't want anybody leaving here going, oh, I was wondering about that, but I felt too dumb or too shy or didn't know how to articulate the question. No? Yes, yeah.
I guess I'm a little unsure of in the prompt. Can it just take an airline as a parameter, like a command line parameter?
No.
No.
Yep.
Okay, because that's what the URL suggests.
Yes.
Okay.
Right. And so right. And this is another thing that I need to clarify in the future in the assignment. It is a true statement that while your servlet supports 3 URLs, one of which is print all of the flights in the airline. Your command line only supports 2 functions, which is adding a flight and searching.
Okay.
Yep.
What do you mean by just 2 functions? We implemented get as well with the airline, right? So how do you mean by?
So there are 3 server-side functions, right? So there's really only one URL, that's the flight, and then you have the stuff to the right of the question mark, which is all the parameters to that URL. And so then there's sort of three functions that it performs. So when you have this first URL with a get, it returns all of the flights. Post will create a new flight in the airline, and then this the second URL, well, the URL with just name, source, and destination. When you do a get there, that'll return the search. What people have been pointing out is that if you look at your command line, there is no way to there's no way on the command line to exercise this first URL, the get of all the flights. Right? Because as you point out, the source and destination are always required. So
But
like,
that's for search, right?
but not get all.
But if we don't specify any airline name, wouldn't the program should
Yes.
return all the list of flights?
Sorry.
All the airlines?
No, you're correct. If the behavior is unspecified, if all you hit is airline/flights, you really need to have an airline name. Yep. So yeah, I don't think I exercised that.
With search option, if we give name of airline, then it should return a flight. Or,
Yes, but you also, in the search option, you also need to provide the source and the destination.
okay, I'll do it through the airline.
Yes. Yeah. If you just give the source, for instance, it'll throw an error. No, that destination. Yeah.
So one more question.
Mhm.
I also posted on Google Community that all the command line arguments in some type of command they might or might not be there. So it's sort of like everything is there or not there. So should we like put everything as an optional?
Yeah, it's true. For Project 4, gone is the distinction between like these are options and these are arguments, because you can have this funny variation. It's starting to fall down, yeah. And so then that's true. Like when you have dash search, then it's like, oh, I only have 3 required arguments, but when I don't have dash search, I have whatever that is, 7 or something like that. Yeah. Yep.
So then just to make sure, the implication is that being a dissonance between the two is that the client is going to request that of the server independent of the user using, like, that's just going to be used to pre-print.
Sorry, what's the that? You said that is going to be
Sorry,
used.
just with the airline as the parameter.
So the first URL. So the get, yes.
Okay. So
This URL with the get will not be invoked by the command line
okay.
program. Yeah.
So which would be invoked by the command line?
This one I'm highlighting right here. The get. So this functionality right here,
So
there's no way to exercise it via the command line.
why not?
This is the way I wrote the assignment. I'm flippant. Why not?
But
It's
my
not.
Because-
program does that. If I just give an airline name, it returns
Oh.
the list of flights.
It turns out I'm not going to test that, so it's okay that it does that. I didn't specify the behavior, but the intent of the assignment is that yes, when you have search, so like I have the dash search right here, that those are the 3 required. So if you say dash search and dash and just the name, I don't really point it out, but that was not the intent, and that's okay. I'm not going to exercise that functionality. Okay. Sorry, what was it? It was debugging. Always be inventing. Okay, so it was debugging Mockito. And what else? Someone else we wanted? That's why I write things down. I don't remember anything anymore. Anything else they wanted to cover?
I think somebody said for command line behavior or something.
Oh, right. So, like, what does it actually do? Yeah, okay. Command line behavior. Okay. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to bring up the code that I wrote last night. Let's walk through it and look at these. Oh, did you have something else, Amanda? Sorry.
I just wanted to verify that if we hit it with the command line, the jar,
Yep.
and it has an error, like if you try to add a flight,
Mhm.
or there's no nothing returned from the search, we have to have like a meaningful error, not just.
Yeah, so not stack trace, not so the same rules apply to user friendliness or gracefulness with this project that I did in other projects. Yep, no, all good questions. Okay, so off to IntelliJ. Okay, so off. Actually, let's hit. Let's hit my repository. Okay, so this is off. This is my Portland State Java summer 2017. And if you go into the airline web, and then you just go into the source here. So these are the classes that we're going to be looking at. So of course, feel free to make a clone of this repository and browse it in IntelliJ. It's probably the easiest way to get familiar with this code. Of course, you can also look at it here. Et cetera, et cetera. But I'm going to look at IntelliJ. So that's where the code lives. You can all see it, and please feel free to use it. Right, I put it out there for you guys to use, as sort of an acknowledgement that I haven't. For many of you, what I have been communicating about the project hasn't been enough to let you be successful yet. Hopefully, this will help get you there. Okay, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what my code does. So I'll do that here in this. I'll just hide that. And I'll hide that. Okay, so here I am in my airline web. And actually I'm going to want another one because this is all double screen. So, let's see here, make sure that's, you guys should be able to see that. Right, yeah. Cool, so move to my checkout here, and then airline web. Okay, so this is where my Maven project is. I've got my POM. I will show you what my command line does. My command line syntax is different from yours. I was too lazy to implement all the dash host and everything like that. But you guys know how to do that already, so that hopefully that's not a big deal. So, well, okay, first of all, I'll do a Maven package to build the jar file. Probably already there. It runs the unit test. That's cool. Builds a jar rather slowly. Okay. Target and then airline web. No, what's the name of it? It's airline.jar. Okay, that's nice. So there's my command line. It has 4 arguments and the 5th one's optional. So host and port, the source airport code, the destination airport code, and then if the number is there, so if a flight number is specified, then it will add a new flight. So that's where it does the post functionality. So let's take a look at it in action. I'll run my Maven Jetty run over here. So I'm running my airline over here. Okay, so then, and this is on port 8080, which is the default. But you know what? And just because a number of you have asked, if you say -d Jetty HTTP port, let's change it just 8888. This will run it on a different port. This is helpful if you are, here it is, it started on port 888. This is helpful if you're like running on one of the Linux machines and multiple of you are using the same machine. You can't both run the same port. I think I've heard people say it's like, oh, I was seeing really weird behavior in my program, only to realize that I was hitting somebody else's server. Right? But yet it was probably something familiar, right? Because like, oh, I'm getting airline data, but that's not my format. That's not my pretty format. This is one of the neat things about the web, right? The client and the server are decoupled, so they don't necessarily know about each other. So you gotta be careful. Okay, so let's run it over here. The host will be localhost. port will be 8888. And then let's see here. So there's probably bugs all over this, but let's see what happens when I have if I ask for all the flights between PDX and LAX and everything's empty. Nope, missing destination. Oh, I missed a flight number. Sorry. No, what do I got? Host, port, host, source, destination. It's saying missing destination.
So you don't have to have flags?
Nope, not the way I implemented it, although I thought it was going to work. Host. Sorry, what? Oh, name. That's right. Yeah. So this is a bug in the. Thank you. So let's fix that. So I'm going to go to my project form main. I'm going to go to the usage method. You know, it's funny because I did that like a dozen. Well, I didn't. I did like 3 times in my unit test too. I kept forgetting the airline name. So airline and the name of the airline. Thank you. Glad you guys are on the ball. I certainly am not. So I'll recompile that. Oh, I just changed my code. Do I need to restart my server? Should I restart my server? Right. I don't need to because I changed my client-side code. Don't need to change my server-side code. Good. Okay, let's try that again. So this is going to complain. And here's the name of the airline. The name of the airline. Let's see here. Oh, why did I put it first? Anyway. Oh, wait, maybe that's not the right order. That's not the right order. I think I put it in the wrong place. Source. Let's see here. Host name, port. Oh, where's the airline? Oh, I bet this. No, this should totally work. Wait a second. Yeah, airline name. Yeah, it's the 3rd. Okay. Sorry, that was wrong again. I should move it down. Oops. I should move it down here. There we go.
How do you do that?
Shift command. Sorry. Yeah, Shift command down on the Mac. And I think on Windows it's Control Shift down. Okay, try it again. Things are in the right order. So host, port, airline, my airline, PDX LAX. No flights. Okay, good. Didn't blow up or anything like that. That's cool. Let's add one. So this will be 1, 2, 3. No output, and that's totally okay. Let's query it again. Oh, good. There's one of it. Really dumb, pretty print. By the way, in my example, in fleshing this out, I didn't bother to do things like add arrival and departure dates. Right? You guys can figure out how to do that. That's sort of all part of, this is basically, hey, how do we get the server communicating? So, and you can imagine then how your program would work, right? I mean, you'd have all the dash search and the dash host and everything like that, et cetera, et cetera. And so let's add another one. Let's add one to Las Vegas, 2, 3, 4. And then, yep, there's only one between those two. And let's add another one to Portland or LAX 3, 4, 5. And now when I query again, I see those two. So that's approximately how yours should work, right? It's that kind of test case. Now, oh, what the heck? I'll give it away. I'm gonna giving mood. So the airline flights. What happens if I do this? Oh, nice. It tells me the required parameter name is missing. Say name equals my airline. Oh, I didn't implement that. That is true. Okay, so I didn't implement the functionality. I guess, yeah, duh, I didn't, because that's her job. So like in yours, if you hit this URL in your browser, which is what I'm going to do, it should print out all of them. I just don't have that functionality implemented. I'll leave an exercise to the reader to do that. So, Halal, was this your question? Like, how does the interaction work? So like, now you can imagine like how I'm going to test your code, right? I'm going to start up your server, and it's like, hey, what happens when there's nothing there? Oh, okay, great. Does it blow up? And then I'm going to add a couple of flights, and I'm going to do some searches, and make sure that the search functionality is valid. Cool. Okay, so on the outside, that's how it works. Now let's take a look at how it works on the inside. So I'm going to stop my my Jetty server, and the first thing I'm going to talk about is unit testing this. Okay, it was really interesting last night as I was trying to figure out how to approach this, and I was trying to figure out how to approach it in a test-driven manner. And so I started on like the client side, and I realized that I was writing integration tests, and you really can't get those working without having the whole system working. And so it's like, well, I wrote all these tests for exercise in the command line, but I couldn't get anything to work until I exercised the servlet. So I guess my lesson was like, you know what? In this case, I prefer to go from the front to back, but sometimes you have to work on the back end first. And so then I wrote my airline servlet first. But I did it using test-driven development. So that means I started my airline servlet test. Now, and I realized, okay, what should I do first? Should I do the get first, or should I do the post first? And I'm like, well, really, the first thing you need to do is create an airline. So I thought, okay, what do I need to do? I've got this servlet. Now, what is the interface for this servlet? Well, it's basically got two methods. It's got doGet and DoPost. So what I want to do is I want to exercise my DoPost method. Okay, so what does my post do? It creates an airline. So it's like, great, I want to have a method which is add one flight. And so what's my given when then? Well, given when, okay, given I have a servlet, when I invoke the DoPost method with input that looks like it comes from hitting the URL, so it's got to be a post, and it's got to have all of the body, in the body of that post has to be parameters that will tell it, the name of the airline and the source, the destination, and the number. Okay, so when I do that, then what happens? Well, what happens is that there's this new flight created in my airline. Okay, great. How do I do that? Because if you look at the DoPost method, what does it take? Well, it doesn't take like a flight object. It takes an HTTP servlet request and an HTTP servlet response. Now, when this runs inside the web container, it's the web container's job, it's Jetty's job to create these objects based on whatever comes in through the HTTP request and give them to your object, to give them to your servlet, right? And this is where things start to get different from probably the program that you've done before. So like certainly in this class, projects 1, 2, and 3 were all like, great, you start with your main method and you call pretty much all your own code. Right? You'll call, your own code for parsing the command line. You'll call your own code for creating an airline and adding a flight to that airline. You'll call your own code for taking that airline and dumping it to a text file. Great, it's all your own code. Yes, I suppose you don't write the, the file writer class. That's Java. But there's just a little bit of, third-party code or a little bit of framework or like the JRE runtime code that you leverage. In this assignment, there's a lot more code that you didn't write. Now, some of that comes from me, and that's like all the stuff that we'll see on the client side once we get to the client side. But a lot of it comes from Jetty, right? So Jetty is the one responsible for taking your the HTTP request that comes in over HTTP and decoding the URL and all that stuff, and then they package all that information up into this object that then you use in your code. And your code, it's not like it starts with a main. Yes, there's a main in Jetty, but what happens is as your web application is deployed, Jetty picks apart your WAR file, your web application, and says, oh, look, I have a servlet. Okay, it'll create that servlet using something called reflection, all available as a screencast for you to watch. And then it'll create, instantiate your airline servlet, right? You never call new airline servlet anywhere in your code, right? It just... it creates it for you, and it says, and then it routes the URL to your servlet. So it's a different kind of coding than you're used to. But okay, how do I unit test this thing? Well, what I really like is to be able to say, hey, I want to be able to call this method, and I want to send it an HTTP servlet request that has the information that I would expect from the client in a post. Meaning I have all of those key value pairs specified. And there's this thing called Mockito that lets you do that. So, and what Mockito does is it provides mock objects. So HTTP servlet request, is it an interface or is it a class? That is an interface. And it's part of the standard, it's part of the Servlet API. So this is a standard set of APIs. They're like interfaces and classes and stuff like that. That are by standard I mean like there's a standard out there. It's JSR 12 or whatever the hell it is. That says, okay, great. If you are going to be if you are going to either write a Java web application or implement a Java web container, here are the interfaces that you need to support, and here is the style of programming that you do. Okay, great. And so then you provide these interfaces, and so like what your servlet ends up getting at runtime, actually when we start debugging, we can take a look, I guess, if you want, is some class, it's some Jetty class, that implements the HTTP servlet request interface. Now, you don't care what the actual class is, all you care is that it implements the interface, then you can interact with it. So, what if I created my own implementation of HTTP servlet request that did exactly what I wanted to for my unit test? Well, you can do that with Mockito. Okay, so now let's take a look at the test. Remember what our given when then was. Given I have a airline servlet. When I call the DoPost method with a HTTP servlet request that simulates the request that I want to test, then the appropriate output is written to, or the expected output is written to the response, and a new flight is created. Okay, let's validate all of that. So the first thing I need to do is I need to send I need to create one of those HTTP servlet requests with the data that I expect. And the kind of data that I expect to be sent in is my airline name, my source, my destination, the number, because we're creating one, and all these need to be strings. So really what I pass in is my number as a string. Through some refactoring, I ended up with a I also have my servlet. So here's my given, and I'm all working towards my when. So like my when is really like, I don't know, like all of this stuff right here. So I refactored stuff into a method called makeRequestOfClass, and this is where the Mockito stuff comes in. So it has a HTTP verb, which is either a get or either a get or a post. It's a little enum right here. And it takes some parameters. It says, okay, send me a servlet, and then I'm going to do something with an airline name, source, destination, and number is string. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create one of these HTTP servlet requests that behaves like a real HTTP servlet request that has those parameters sent to it. There is this magical method called mock. And you give it the JavaLine class, the dot class for the interface or even the class that you want to then create one of these mock objects for. So when you call this, what it does is it returns an implementation, an object that implements the HTTP servlet request class, and it behaves. And then what you can do is you can take that and you can tell it how to behave, right? This is cool stuff, and probably way beyond what I expect you to know, but I think I expect you to know how to use it, and so, yes, she's got piano lessons. Every time at 6:30. Anyway, so I'm going to create one of these mock classes, and I'm going to tell it what to do. I'm going to use a magical method called when. So, hey, listen, when my mock requests get parameter method is called with the value name. Right, so getParameter is a method on that interface that takes a string and returns a string. Then I want to return the string airline name. This getParameter method is the same getParameter method which is invoked in your servlet by this guy, I guess. It calls request.getParameter. But see, your code doesn't care that you're sending one of these mock things because they both implement the HTTP servlet request method. So I'm training my mock object what to do. So when you're asked for your name parameter, return the airline name that was passed in. And here in my test, my airline name is simply my airline. Similarly for the source, destination, and number. So what I'm doing is I'm creating like this pretend HTTP servlet request that doesn't come from Jetty, it just comes from this mock object that has these behaviors. So that when its getParameter method is called with these various values, then it'll return certain other values. So that's my mock behavior. Now, request, so HTTP servlet request has also other methods, but you don't need to specify the behavior there because, as it turns out, your code, if your code doesn't call it, who cares, right? And it turns out that all my code, or all the code that's under test calls, is the get parameter method. So that's all it needs to be able to do, is all my servlet request needs to be able to do. So I've mocked that. And so now I'm going to send this mock request object off to my DoPost method. Now the other thing I need to send to my DoPost method is a mock response. So okay, cool. I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to mock my response. And if I look what my code does with the response, all it does is it calls print writer. So I'm going to create a mock print writer. Sure. And then when I say, hey, when my response's get writer method is called, which happens somewhere, I think, get writer. Yeah, so there it is. So it's called there. So when that thing is called, return this mock this mock writer. So what I'm basically doing is I'm setting up these like pretend objects, but I can do two things. I can tell them what to do, and then I can ask them how they were interacted with, and we'll see that next. But just to conclude, so this is my my win. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying, okay, great, I've set up these two mock objects, and when I want to do a get, I'll call do get, and I'll send the request and the response, similarly for the post. And if you try to send anything else there, I'm going to blow it up because I don't know how to do it yet. So, and what am I doing? Well, I'm calling my DoPost method. Nothing magical here. This is my DoPost method. So right now, remember, this is running completely outside of Jetty. This is just treating my airline servlet as like any other Java code. So normally it would run in a web container like Jetty, but now it's just Java code. Right? Java code is Java code. So I do that. So this is my when. So given that I've got an airline servlet, when I make a request of that servlet with those parameters, what happens? Well, the first thing I'm going to verify, I guess what I'm going to verify here, because no output is written to the print writer. Maybe I should add something there. Then what do? Well, I added a method to my servlet called getAirline, and so my servlet has an airline object, and then I added an accessor for it, a getAirline. And notice I only need it for testing. Right, because normally no one else would do this, but the testing in order to test it, or it's a lot easier to test it if you can just get the airline object. So fine. So there I say, hey servlet, I just sent you this request and I got that response. Oh yeah, I make sure that so the first thing I do after I make my request using all these mock objects is I want to make sure that it returned error code 200, that everything's copacetic. And the way I do that is by interacting with the mock. I basically say the following. It's like, hey, mock response, verify that your setStatus method was called with the value scok, which is 200. Because when everything is happy with doGet, I set my status to scok. This is super weird, right? Because it's like I'm executing Java code and I'm using these mock objects that basically keep track of the values that their methods were called with, right? This is for me, like when I started looking at this stuff, it's like, wow, this is really powerful. And then I started daydreaming about how the implementation was to work and how cool that would be. But then I it's like, I don't know, I got to focus on using it. But this is really powerful because now you can interact with your airline servlet, which normally runs inside a container and has all these things running around and all this stuff with your request, but I can just treat it like unit test code. And because it's unit test code, I can develop it outside my server, which is really, really faster than having to like redeploy my web application every time just to poke it and debug it. So anyway, so I make sure that scok, that the status was set to scok, and then I just basically go through, and this is like straight old regular JUnit stuff, right? I go and I get my airline, and I make sure that's the name that I expect. So the airline that was created is the airline that I expect, and then I look at its flights. Hey, there should be one flight. Okay, and the source of that flight is the source that I expect, destination, and the number. So this is all part of my my when. Right here, all of those assertions and all of that checking. Now, what do you need to know to use this practically? Well, pretty much everything that's here in the method, right? So I mean, you can copy and paste this, and there was similar stuff in the key value example. But you create one of these mock objects, and then you tell it what to do under certain conditions. So what do you think? So you were the one that asked about Mockito, right?
Yeah.
Does this help? Does it make any sense?
Yeah, it helps out a lot. Can you maybe go over what the whole syntax of the verify statement?
Yeah. Here's what I'll do. Let's add something. Let's add something that will fail. So let's say, right now, as we saw, like here, when I go and I add my airline, it's silent. And that's not so cool. So let's say, let's change it. So now I want to say, hey, listen, in addition to like adding this airline, let's just have it write a message to the response saying that a flight was successfully added. And so I can say, okay, verify that. Let's see here. Response dot get writer. That's that print writer that I mocked out. That its print line method was called. Verify that that print line was called with successfully added a flight. Oops, how come it doesn't? No, get too many of those. Okay, so what am I doing here? I'm saying verify so that some objects, this is going to be a mock object, that its print line method was called with successfully added a flight. So now I'm going to run this test. Forgetting the keyboard shortcuts. Yeah, it's Shift F10. And it failed. Let me get the full stack trace. Okay, so another thing you got to get used to with Mockito is how to interpret failures. So it's saying, okay, here on line 46, so my verify, it's saying wanted but not invoked. So I wanted, or I expected, that this print writer.println would be invoked with the string successfully added a flight. However, there were 0 interactions with this mock. No one called println on that. It's like, oh, okay. And then like it seems to duplicate the error for some reason. Okay, well, that's true. I am not doing that. And so I should do that in my DoPost. So now I'll, in my DoPost, let's do get. Where's my DoPost? Make it bigger. After all of this stuff, all error checking, great. Before I set the status, I'm going to say response.getWriter.println, whatever that text was. And this is why I have the messages class, because I can never remember like what all this stuff is. So that's why I have all that messages nonsense. It makes it easier to test. Now I have duplicate code, and so I should put this into a constant. Oh wait, I'll get it green first, and I'll refactor it. That's what you're going to say, right? So now I'll run it again. Yay, and it passes because now I added code. See this new code right here that calls the getWriter on the response. When I run the unit test, this will call like the mock object that keeps track of like all the values that println was invoked with. And then the verify will basically say, hey, make sure that println was invoked with that value. And then, so I'll extract a constant here. Sure, successfully added a flight. And then, oops. Airline servlet, successfully added a flight. Run it again. Yeah, after my refactoring it still worked. Did that help?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, pretty wild, huh?
Oh yeah, it's kind of weird how you're like not checking for the output of that like println statement, but you're checking on invocation.
Yeah. Right. So another thing that I could do. Okay. So yes, alternatively, I could use an object. No, I could. Well, yeah. So what I could do is I could use when I set up the mock object. So instead of using Mockito, instead of using this mock print writer, I could have a print writer that then is wrapped around a string writer that would capture the print line to it and in a string writer, and then here in the code I could then get the print writer, cast it, and then I think I can get then the underlying writer, cast that to a string writer, and get the string. This is easier,
Yeah.
but actually, it is interesting, and I think it's a good observation that what you're verifying is like the interaction with the object, and not the output, not the side effects of it. And for a unit test, that's appropriate, I feel, because it's really testing at the lowest level. But it's true. So what you're doing is you're exposing what's happening inside the method, and then if you then change what happens inside the method, it becomes fragile. But on the other hand, I guess on the other hand, it's like part of the contract of the method is that it prints the statement to the writer. So I don't know. It is an interesting design decision for your unit tests.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yep. So anyway, super cool, and I don't know if it's the best way to do because Mockito takes a while, to get a little while to get used to. But if you're, if you want to experiment with writing some unit tests for your airline servlet, this is the best way to do it, in my opinion. So, any questions on that unit test or Mockito? Because next I want to look at the airline servlet itself. Okay, oops. Airline servlet has three public methods. DoGet, DoPost, and DoDelete. Let's look at DoPost first. Right? Oh, I didn't update the comment. Sorry. What post does is it creates a new flight in the airline. So it is sent a bunch of parameters, like name for the name of the airline and source. And so I've got all of this this boilerplate error checking code here to make sure that it was that the parameter was specified. So I have this helper method, get parameter takes the name and a request. Get parameter does things like just will translate an empty value into null if that's necessary. And so like right here, it's like, hey, great. Give me the value of the name parameter that came in the HTTP request, and if it's null, hey, that's required. So say missing required parameter. What this does is it sends an error back with the response with a particular code, HTTP status code, and then the message. And so this writes it back to the response. So this will send it back to the client, wherever the client is. And then it returns. So DoPost doesn't have anything else to do because it's errored out. And so I do it for name and for source and for destination and for number. So all these are required for post. Then I convert number into an int. And then I do the following. I say I have this create or validate airline with name. And this basically checks to say, hey, if there is an airline, make sure the name of the airline is the same as the airline that was passed in the DoPost. Otherwise, create a new airline, and it returns whether or not it was created. If it wasn't created because of an error, then spit out an error message. So lots of error checking. And actually, I think someone noticed this on or there was a post about it on the community. You need to validate. Well, actually, as you learned in Project 2, you need to validate all information that comes into your program, no matter where it comes in from. So in Project 2, for instance, what were the sources of inputs into your program? Text file and command line. Right, there were two. And for those of you who got tripped up on that test case where I took like an existing file and changed the date to like 3x's or whatever it was, right? You're like, oh, I didn't realize I had to validate it to that level. Yep, the answer is yes. This is what happens when your teacher works for a security company, right? And you got to protect everything. What do you need? Where do you need to validate your input in Project 4? Yeah, both client and server. So the command line. What comes in the command line, it's like your dates need to validate there. And then you also need to validate your dates, your airport codes, and all of that stuff on the server also. Because remember, there's, you don't necessarily have a trusted client. It could be, yes, your servlet could be the URLs that your servlet supports could be invoked from the client, and then you're pretty sure you can do some checking and stuff like that. Or it could just be called by any idiot with a web browser, right? This is the way it works. So you need to protect that also. And there was probably a point to what I was saying, but I don't remember what it was now. So anyway, this is why you need to, so a lot, just like with your command line, how a lot of 80% of what you do is input validation. Same thing with your servlet. A lot of what you do is input validation. But once you validate all of your input good, then you can safely move on to real work, like creating a flight. And so my flight is lame. It's only got a source, destination, and number. And then you add it to the airline. And then you print back your response. So that's what post does. So that's how I create an airline. Hopefully, those of you who are still working on Project 4 can say, okay, yeah, here's, I now know how I could take something that looks like this and then extend it to have, more information, more data. So that populates the flight. Yay! Okay. That's the DoPost. Let's look at the DoGet, and let's look at the test for get. So it's called Pretty Print Flights Between Airports. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create 3 flights, actually just like I did in the command line, 2 of which go between PDX and LAX, and the other one goes between PDX and LAS, Las Vegas. And then I'm going to search for all flights between PDX and LAX. And I'm going, so my given is, given I have a servlet, when I populate it with those 3 flights and I do a search, then I expect the search results to include the numbers of the flights between those 2 airports. So how do I implement that? So given I've got a servlet, when I post to my URL, I post my servlet, there's no URL really, with a flight between Portland and LAX 123, LAS 234, LAX 345. When I do a get of my servlet with for that airline between PDX and LAX with no number, then I expect that I get a 200 back. That my server code, or whatever SC stands for, servlet code maybe, is okay. Status code. Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, it should be status. Anagram of stock. Anyway, and I expect that what was ever written to and what was ever written to my pretty printer contains what I expect. Here's how you do that. So you asked about, well, in Mockito, I want to get what's written to my to my print line statement and then interrogate it and ask questions about it. The Mockito API, and here again, you can learn more about this in the dependency injection lecture, has something called an argument captor, which basically allows you to say, hey, whatever was written to print line, capture it in my argument captor, and then I want to get the value back. So the value that I get back is a string, because it was a string. I'm capturing a string here from my print line. And now I'm using regular old Hamcrest assert to say, okay, whatever I captured from my print line method, make sure it contains the strings 1, 2, 3, 3, 4, 5. Those are the 2 flights that go between those airports, and it doesn't contain the string LAS. So now we run it, and it passes. Right? So here again, we're using this Mockito thing to sort of put all the right pieces in place so that when my servlet code runs, it just interacts with those HTTP requests and HTTP response objects, just like any, it doesn't care that it's Mockito objects. It just interacts with them the way it does, and then I'm able to do things like, hey, Mockito, please go tell me the value that was invoked with the print line method, and then ask some questions about it. So in my doGet method, after doing the required input validation, and interesting, it'll create the airline, which is probably the right behavior. Now I get down to it. I have a method called pretty print between flights, or between that. And so I'm going to create a string builder that ultimately gets returned as the pretty print. I didn't write a pretty printer object. I cheated, and I used the stream API because I think I'm clever. And so I create a string buffer, and I use these chaining appends to say, hey, flight between this source and that destination. And then I print out all the flights, and that's what results. Is something like this. Did you guys watch the Java 8 lecture to learn about the Stream API? You can do fun things like this. You can say, hey, give me all your flights, right? Flights from the airlines, just a list of flights. Say, give me this stream. That's a stream of flights. And I can do things like, hey, take that stream and filter in all of the flights. So this is a lambda expression right here. Actually, sorry, this whole thing is a lambda expression right there, which is just a fancy. Can I convert that? Oh, I can't. Yeah, I can't do it easily. This is just some syntactic sugar for basically a one over an interface with one method that will take a flight and return a boolean, and it'll return true if the source of whatever flight is there in the stream, so basically there in the list, has its source is equal to the source that I'm looking for, and its destination is equal to the destination that I'm looking for. And so then that'll basically filter in all of the flights that I care about, and it'll say, hey, for each one of those flights that I care about, is there something called F here and flight there? I should probably just call it F to be consistent. I will say, okay, great, append 2 spaces, and then I'll append the flight, which will invoke its toString method, and then it'll invoke it. It'll put a new line there. So anyway, that's how I generate this. Luckily, you've already written a pretty printer that does a much prettier job than this, and so you don't need to worry about my fancy stuff. And then, so this builds up the string buffer, and I just return the string value of that back up here. And that's my pretty text, and so I'm gonna just say, hey, print that to my writer. And this print line right here is the value here ends up getting captured by this guy right here. And so then my pretty string gets stored in this argument captor object, and then I can get that string by calling getValue. Wacky stuff, right? This is pretty advanced. And so then if you want to dive into it, I think you'll be rewarded with unit tests for your airlines, impress your friends type thing. Impress your coworkers if you're an intern. Tell them Dave sent you. Don't tell them that. That gets weird. But anyway, it's this is how you can do something like write a unit test for a servlet. And people tried to do this for a long time, and everybody wrote their own implementation of HTTP servlet response, blah blah blah. Well, you can use Mockito, and as long as you understand the Mockito magic, and a lot of it is actually Mockito is really well documented. You can go off to mockito.org, and I think they do a really good job of explaining it, probably much better than I have today. But anyway, that's Mockito. Okay. Time for a drink. So we've seen what's happening on the server side. We've looked at the servlet, and we've shown how we can write unit tests for the servlet if we're so inclined. That's only half of the equation. Now we need to figure out what happens on the client side. So the client starts with project 4. Project 4, nothing special here. This is just a command line program. So how do I? Yes, indent with 2 spaces because whatever. Anyway, just a command line program. Goes through parts of the command line, and I guess the thing that's interesting is it creates one of these airline REST clients. And we'll take a look at this in a moment. Don't need a message because it's never used apparently. Oh, you know what? I wanted to do again. No, sorry. Yeah, crap. Okay. Where was I? I was up here. Okay. So I parsed the command line, and so now I got to do some more input validation. Hey, if source is missing, destination is missing, otherwise fine. If you didn't provide, okay, if you so the semantics here are on the command line. If I specify a number, I want to add that flight. If I don't specify the number, I want to query. That's the way it works. Okay, so how do I code that? Well, if flight number is string, which comes in from the command line is null, then I want to do the query. And so then on my client, I will call my getFlightsBetween method. Otherwise, I'll parse that. If it's not null, then I'll parse my flight number as string as an integer, get my flight number. I'll create a flight, which is what I do. Even though it's a client side, I create a flight and then send it to my addFlight method on my client. So this is the command line. You guys know how to parse the command line, right? Anything about parsing the command line, anything you want to talk about or ask? Okay. So the more interesting thing is what's going on with this airline REST client. So several of you asked on the community, like, hey, do I need to change the airline REST client? And I'm like, yeah, darn, like, that wasn't obvious. Okay, sorry. Yes, you need to change the airline REST client because the airline REST client is the thing that puts together the URLs that go to your servlet. And so you're adding new stuff to your servlet, and so you're going to have to change how the client interacts with that servlet. So let's look at how the client interacts with that servlet. Let's first look at the addFlight method. Oh, before I do though, I want to talk a little bit about the purpose of the airline REST client. So the job of the airline REST client is to hide all of like the formation of the URL and calling the URL and handling the HTTP error codes, or sorry, HTTP status codes, stuff like that. Hide that all from your command line program, right? We want to have separation of responsibilities. And our the classes in this program have very separate responsibilities. All project4.java is responsible for is parsing the command line, right? That's what it's good at, right? It knows the order of the arguments of the command line. It knows how to, what things in int, blah, blah, blah. That's all it's good at. The airline REST client is responsible for basically displaying, for representing the airline to the Project 4 command line program, right? So it's going to hide all of these details about interacting with the servlet, and you do this so that you don't have things like it's confusing, and actually it's unnecessary to have your command line program be aware of like HTTP status code 400 and stuff, right? The abstraction, the fact that the airline is stored on on a web server, yes, it kind of has to know about it, but you want to limit its exposure to that. So, for instance, when something goes wrong, so let's say you get a HTTP, you get like a error code 400 or 500 or something. When the airline REST client makes a HTTP call and like a bad thing happens when it comes back, or when it comes back with an error message, it throws an exception. That's a reasonable thing for a Java class to do, right? When something goes wrong, it throws an exception. It doesn't try to like return some error code or an object that has both like the content and there. Nope, it should throw an exception. And so then airline REST client is meant to abstract all of that away from the client as much as possible. So as a result, its method, its interface for adding a flight takes an airline number and a flight object. Why not? Right? It's a flight object. And that way, for instance, the number can be represented as an int, instead of a string, because it's meant to be an int. So the data is more strongly typed this way. So great. It takes an airline and a flight. And so what does this code need to do? It needs to make a post request of the server. Now there's a little bit more stuff I guess I should highlight. So when we created the airline REST client, it has two parameters to its constructor, the host name and the port, which come in from the command line. So the airline REST client knows what its URL is, and it's stored here in this URL object. And so it's so it's the URL. It has the host name, the port, and then the airline and the flights. So if you go look in the assignment, that corresponds to, and I can't highlight it very well. That's basically everything to the left of the question mark. And that's the base of your URL, right? It's I can't remember, is it the file part? What's that called? The location part? But anyway, it's that part of your URL, everything to the left of the question mark. And in the post, you want to have the airline name on there, and then you have the parameters. Right, so you have your URL there. So now when you go to add your flight, what do? Well, I have this convenient post to my URL, which basically says, hey, take these key value pairs, which again was super confusing when what you were adding was keys and values, and post it to that URL. And here's how you use that. You say, okay, the name parameter will be the airline name, the SRC, the source parameter will be source, destination, and then the number will be the string value of the get number there. Right, so source, destination, number, and name all correspond to what is said here. So the name is up here in this URL, and I think someone asked about it, and I think they were right. It's strictly speaking, it's not appended to the URL. It's sent in the body of the request. I guess it does mention it here. So yeah, the name is sent in the body of the request in the post. That's all there. So anyway. I think this is the secret sauce that many of you are looking for, and this is why I didn't explain very well with the key value pair example. And like I said, I'll fix that for next time. So what this does is it makes a post, and post to my URL calls this post method, and this is all helper method stuff, or at least I thought it was helping method stuff from this HTTP request helper, which is my class, and you can go look into it if you want, or you can just accept that it works. Oops. So anyway, so that was airline REST client right there. So that's how it does the post. Now, we want to write a code. So as I was developing this, I wanted to do a test-driven. So how do I do that? This guy, it would be hard for me to write a true unit test for this because I'd have to mock out all of the interaction with the server. And so what I have to do, mock out like the entire HTTP protocol? That sounds awful. Maybe mock out some, I don't know. So I sort of threw my hands up in the air and said, okay, fine. I'll write an integration test, which means that the Jetty server will be running when I run my integration test. So what does my integration test look like? Well, the first thing I need to do is, with any integration test, I need to clear out any data that's running there in the airline already. And I do that by invoking this remove airline method on the client. And what this does is it sends a delete to my URL. And actually, this is something I didn't point out. Here in my airline servlet, I've got a do delete method, which simply nulls out the airline. Okay, so now I can test that. So that's my airline REST. That's the first thing I do in all my integration tests. I clear out the airline. Okay, now my first test is like add me a flight using my REST client. So how do I do that? Well, I have this helper method, which is new airline REST client, which creates it on the host and port that I want, and I make it configurable, et cetera, et cetera. But I've got my new airline REST client, and I'm going to create my airline name and a flight, and I'm going to add it. And that's all I'm going to do. And that should, if there's something problematic, it'll blow up. So like for instance, let's see, I'm not running my Jetty right now, right? Right. So if I try to run this test without my server running, oh wait, I'm getting this problem. Empty test suite. I've seen this last night and I wasn't sure why. Sometimes I run the whole thing. Huh. Airline REST client IT empty test suite. Why does it think that? I don't know. This is IntelliJ. So like, yeah, what did I do to fix this?
So I think like I ran into this problem a few times, and it's when like you build your project with Maven. I'm trying to remember the
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I should rebuild the project here.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's surprising. Thank you. It blows up mightily with a connection refuse exception. Okay, well that's cool. That kind of makes sense. So now I will start my server, and I'll start it on the default port, which is 8080, so that that's what my test runs against. And now I'll run it. Yay! And it passed. So that basically means it's able to call add flight and no exception was thrown. If it got in a 500, oh, like what happens if I try to run it again? Oh, interesting. Oh yeah, because I didn't implement, did I? I don't think I implemented the check that actually returns, that actually has an error. No, it should have a non-matching error name. So now if I change my test to have a different airline name, and I ran it, oops, it should blow up, right? Yeah. And how does it blow up? Okay. So remember I said that my airline REST client, I don't want to expose things like HTTP error codes. And yet you can get like non-200. And if you get a non-200, you want to let the client know. And so what it does is it throws this appointment book REST exception method, which some of you might see in your projects. And it says, I got a HTTP status code of 412, and the airline, and then the message was airline not named my airline 2, which is what you'd expect. But it comes back as an exception, and this means that the code that calls it, like your main method, can catch that exception and handle it and give it a nice graceful error message. Anyway, if I wanted to, well, actually I don't want to keep that change permanently. But now if I run this test, it'll then, sorry, let me do that then. If I run this test, clean out all of my my airlines, so there's only one of them. And then if I run this again, it should pass with my airline 2. Yep. But now everything else is messed up. So this is, when you're running your integration tests, remember, even though your integration test exits, your server is still running, right? You've still got your Jetty there is still holding your airline. And so then you need to be aware of that. Okay. So add one flight. I'm going to add some more flights in my second class. And so as we'll see, so I'll just run this one. Oops. Oh, airline, not name my airline. Okay, yeah, we need to start over again. Run this. Add one flight. Add 2 more flights. Now if I go to my command line and I execute my query, oops, not on port 8888 anymore, it's on port 8080. I see my 2 flights. See what I'm doing here? Right, I'm leveraging the fact that my server runs the entire time. I can use my command line, I can use my integration test with my server. I can use my command line with my server. It all works because they're just talking HTTP to the server. There's not really any magic here, but you're seeing multiple ways of accessing. As a matter of fact, I can just go also, if you aren't completely impressed yet, I can say airline's my airline, and then the source equals PDX, and the destination equals LAX. Oops, and it has to be on the right port again. Poof, and there it is. Right? It's the magic of the web. Yeah, so anyway. So there's multiple ways to get at your data, and this is exactly what we want. Okay, so now, and I've demonstrated, because this is my REST client, so this is actually, an integration test that interacts with my server. And now my final final test is basically I've implemented the same test, where I've showed you the same behavior in 3 different ways, right? I showed it to you from the command line where I create these 3 airlines and I query and make sure there's 2 of them. I wrote a unit test where I created those same 3 flights, and I wrote a unit test that verified that the 2 actually get pretty printed. And now I'm going to do it from the REST client. So now I actually have a client that's actually talking real HTTP to my servlet running in Jetty, and it verifies the same thing. So I'm going to say get flights between PDX and LAX on my airline, and it's going to return some pretty output. Now this is actually calling it's invoking the do-get method, and it's returning the result over the wire. There's a pretty, and make sure that yes contains 1, 2, 3, and 3, 4, 5, but not LAS. And then you run this and it passes. So this is an integration test that tests the airline REST client. Any questions on that? So I recommend that you you too write some integration tests for this, and that'll help you have nice separation of responsibilities between your various parts. Yeah.
So is there going to be a test with a different airline name?
Could be.
Because I actually.
Actually, is there? No, no, you're right. Because I think I said it was. You're right. I said I wasn't going to test that because people asked me. It was you who asked, like, hey, can I support multiple airlines? I'm like, well, I didn't say it could.
I had already done it analogous to the key value pair,
Right.
in which there were multiple key
So no, I'm
values,
not going to
but
test
yeah,
that.
so-
So yeah, in my program, I decided to make that an error. That's the way my crazy brain thinks. But you're right. You guys were. It makes much more sense to have a support multiple airlines. But anyway, cool. Okay. There's one more test, and I'm going to let you guys figure it out. I also have an integration test for my command line. And it does exactly the same thing, right? Test 0, remove the airline. Test 1, add 1 flight. But now instead of using my, instead of having it be a unit test that calls the servlet directly, instead of having it be an integration test that calls airline rest client directly, it calls the command line. And so it just exercises the command line. This is the thing I showed you at the beginning of all of this, where the first thing you do is add this flight, then add a couple more flights. Oh, and then this actually does the query, and it does the query. And so it says, hey, now make sure the text was written to standard error. Make sure the text that was written to standard out contains those same things. So So this allows you to test all of your code. With so it allows you to test the project for main class, lets you test the airline rest client, and it lets you test the servlet. And so everything's tested. And so now you know it works. Oh, debugging. One more thing, because we're ready for a break. I'm ready for a break. Wait, let me quick show you debugging. Okay. Let's walk through it. So here's what we're going to do. We are going to. I need to stop my Jetty. We are going to walk through what happens when the main method is invoked in this test. So I am going to, and I want to debug things. So what I need to do is I'm going to run my client as the integration test. I'm going to run it under the debugger in IntelliJ. But but it's an integration test. It needs to run against Jetty. So I also need to configure my Jetty to run in debug mode. And the way I do that, I'll start over here. Okay, so the easiest way to do it is you make a new configuration, and you make what's called a remote configuration. Oh, I've already got one, but I'll delete this one and start over again. Create what's called a remote configuration, not React. Hello? Why am I not seeing it? Oh, my mouse is right on it. It's obviously time for a break. Okay. This basically tells IntelliJ, like, hey, there's going to be a VM out there, and it's going to be listening for a debugger to connect to it on a given port. So I'm just going to call it Jetty server. And I've configured it to run, well, I'm saying it'll be running on localhost and port 5005. That's cool. IntelliJ is nice enough to give you these little shortcuts for configuring the remote JVM, which in our case will be our Jetty server, so that it can be connected to. You click this little for whatever reason, 3 dots here to copy it to the clipboard. And then when running Jetty from the command line, you need to set an environment variable called Maven ops. Oops, Maven ops to that value that you copied from IntelliJ. And now when you run, Jetty run, you'll see the first thing it says is scrolls by the screen too fast. Listening for transport DT socket at address 5005. This is what the JVM spits out when it's running in debug mode, or in debug mode. So good. I'm now debugging it. Okay, that's cool. And so I'm going to save this guy over here, and now I'm selected over here. So when I click the little bug icon, that will attach IntelliJ to the machine running at, it'll attach the debugger to whatever JVM is running on localhost 5005. And now, if I set a breakpoint in my airline servlet, let's say in my DoPost method, Oh, I already got one here. It should stop. It should stop there. So for instance, let's post something. So let's post this here on COD 8080. So we're dealing with multiple ports here, right? HTTP is on port 8080. Debugging is on port 5005. And let's just have 1000, flight 1000. I hit return. The debugger stopped because my command line program did a post to my web server, and now here it is. And now I can interrogate things. So I don't know how much of how much debugging you really want me to go through, but I will point out a couple of things. Remember, I was talking about how the HTTP servlet request is just some interface as part of the Servlet API. Well, at runtime, that object that's passed in as the request is actually this org eclipse jetty server.request. So that's the runtime object, is this implementation by Jetty. And so then this thing, has all sorts of information. You can open it up, like the channel and the input. Who knows what all that stuff means? But it can tell you things like, the context path and the servlet path. Probably not too terribly interesting here. And so now you can step through it. It's like the airline name, there it is, my airline, which was passed in right here, my airline. And so then you can step through all of this. And you can see the numbers, the string is 1000. And by the way, I'm using F8 to step over. Is that what F8 is? Yeah, step over. Et cetera, et cetera. So this is debugging a this is debugging a server-side application. Press F9 to just continue running. And there it goes, and the program exited, and everybody's happy. Oh, and now you can go look, and you can see, oh, I also have one in get. So I did a get. I'm just going to continue here, and you can see that, yes, flight 1000 was added. Okay, so if you are interacting with your command line program, this is how you can debug the server. If you want to debug a client, you can do it two ways. If you can't, you can debug. You can set those. It's not Maven ops. What the hell? If you really want to, you can create another remote JVM, and we'll call it project 4 command line. Well, let's call it project 4. Yeah, command line. And you can have that running on a different port, 5050. Yeah, let's do 5006. And here I want it to listen. No, wait. Oh, what did I just do? That's crazy. Yeah, because I want to wait for, when I launch the command, I want it to wait for the debugger to attach. So now if I say Java with all that nonsense, oh my gosh, what is all of that? That's a lot. When I launch it, oh, no, it is not. Yeah, what's fully? What is all that? What is all that stuff? Listen. Okay, I'm not happy with that. We're just gonna say suspend yes. That was all sorts of crazy right there. 1001, and we want to say suspend yes, which means the program will start, but it'll wait for a debugger to attach before doing anything of meaning. So the process starts up, and it's saying there, hey, I'm listening for someone to talk to me at port 5006. And so let's make sure to set a breakpoint in our main method. Right here. And now I can attach to that program. So I'm currently attached to two programs right here, the Jetty server and the Project 4 command line. So this is kind of crazy, right? Same IntelliJ attached to two different Java programs, and they're debugging both of them. And so things will stop in various places. So now let's just go through all of this. Yeah, okay. Here's where I care about. Yeah, let's see. I think I can just run to here. Let's see. How do I do that? Run to cursor. Oh, say what? What? I may need to put the cursor there first. Cursor. Force run to cursor. Oh, wow. Okay, it didn't like that. Oh, I was there. Okay, oops. Oh, okay, that's where I create it. Oh, sorry. What I really wanted, well, let's just step through it. Okay, and I got my flight number. Okay, created my flight. Okay, so I've created my flight, and I'm about to call add flight. And add flight will invoke my post method. So now when I go next here, poof, I'm off debugging in my post method, which is in a different process. And this is where it gets kind of confusing, right? You're debugging the command line. So this is server-side code. The command line over here is, if I pause it so I can see where it's at, it's on some, is in post to URL. Actually, it is right here. Project 4 is off of my client side. Debugging gets really complicated. You're doing distributed programming, right? And so now you're doing distributed debugging, which means you have multiple processes that are talking to each other at different points in their code. One's waiting for the other right now because it's waiting on this socket request. So it makes this request off to the server. But this gets more complicated than any of your projects so far. But this is cool. This is why, and this is one of the things I want you to learn is to figure out how to develop in this environment. So this is how you can debug. This is how you can attach to both processes. Let's just let the Jetty server do its thing, and then we'll unpause. Oops. Well, and then we'll continue over here. It says it's still going. There. Now it finished. So that's how you can attach to two different processes. I don't recommend that you do that. I think it's kind of tough. I recommend that you write unit tests instead. And so what you can do, write automated tests instead. So you can go to your Project 4 integration test, which seems to have fallen off. There it is. And now I've set my debugger here. And so what I can do is I can just run all of my stuff, all my classes. I can just debug the entire class. And now it's stopped there, and so that's going to invoke my main. I'll just step over that. I have that nonsense. Oh yeah, well, I guess there it lets me debug my, I'm here in my main, I'm here in my Project 4 main now. That's sweet, but I don't really care about it. Now I'm here in my DoPost, right? You're going back and forth again because you're dealing with multiple things, and then I keep continuing on. And it's hitting DoPost multiple times, and so I can do things like I can inspect the request. Here again, you can do stuff like evaluate expression and say request.get parameter map. Oh, that's super ugly. ToString. There you go. Like the map is name equals my airline, destination equals LAX, source equals PDX. You can do stuff like this. Anyway, debuggers are awesome, and debuggers are not cheating. Okay, right? You're grown-ups now. You can use a debugger. It's okay. It helps you get your work done. Use your tools. Okay. Debugging Mockito and command line behavior. And that was like an hour and a half. Any other question about Project 4? Because I have a question for you about Project 4. Do you feel better prepared to execute on your Project 4 now? Was this helpful? This is what you want to see? Sorry, okay. This is what I tried to explain 2 weeks ago. And I wasn't as prepared as I could have been. I don't think you guys were ready yet either. You're probably heads down in like Project 2 or Project 3. We're about to take a break, but then there's one question I want to ask you, which is what do you want to do after break? So, given that, I'm guessing there are a lot of you out there that are still heads down in Project 4. We have two things that we can do after break. I can go through a similar exercise with Project 5 in GWT. And we'll look at the code, and we'll see how to debug, and we'll answer some questions there. However, if there are a lot of you that are still thinking about Project 4, and even though it's due Friday, I don't know if you're going to be in the right headspace to really absorb it. So if you don't want to talk about Project 5, yes, we can wait another week. And if we don't do that, then let's continue on with the Minecraft, the Minesweeper kata. We can do some pair programming instead. So think about it over break. Think about how you want to use the rest of our time tonight, because it'll probably be another solid hour of me talking at the code and you asking questions. If we talk about Project 5, but it'll help you get started. And otherwise we can do some more pair programming, and that's always good too. So think about it. Let's come back in like 10 minutes. So 7:37.